everyone, and welcome to Talking Out a Line. As you know, this show is about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. On today's episode, we'll be exploring the topic of sports and DEIB. Our special guests are Professor Marty Dobrow and Chris Rim, who have their podcast called Liberty, Justice, and Ball that talks about social justice and basketball.
Yeah, Professor Marty Dobrow has been a part of the Springfield College faculty since 1999. He's a professor in the Department of Literature, Writing, and Journalism. Dobrow is also an author of 2 books on sports in the U.S., alongside having published stories in The Atlantic, Boston Globe, and ESPN. He's won many awards and recognition for his stories and sports writing within the United States.
His co-host, Chris Rim, has recently graduated from Springfield College and was a student of Professor Dobrow with a bachelor's degree in journalism. In school, he was a varsity track and field athlete and was part of the student athlete leadership team. He's also now a reporter for the New York Times. He hopes to use sports and individual athletic stories to give voice to underrepresented groups in society and hopefully inspire a change in communities. In their podcast, they do just that by discussing issues of social justice and race and how it intertwines with individuals in the sport of basketball.
Let's take a look at some statistics of how various athletes are being affected by problems of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging within their respective sports. In the NFL, almost 74% of the players are people of color, while 87% of the coaching staffs are white. The NBA has become the most diverse sport franchise with the most Black and Latino players out of any other sport. In contrast, hockey is the least diverse sport. In an NCAA study, only 1% of players identified as Black and 75.6% of players identified as white. Male athletes in basketball, golf, soccer, baseball, and tennis make anywhere from 15 to 100% more than female athletes.
Women's sports accounts to 5.7% of coverage in ESPN, which is not looking so good. Ever since Title IX was implemented 40 years ago, women athletes have skyrocketed from 10 to 41% of women in high school, which will help in building a robust pipeline of female athletes in the professional level in the US going forward. However, structural inclusion in the professional sporting world, for example, more airtime in ESPN, needs to take place for that to be realized for aspiring women identifying athletes in the United States. So things are looking like they're trending in the right direction. And we're happy to have with us in this episode Professor Marty Dobrow and Chris Rim to talk about sports and DEIB, and that focuses on their podcast, Liberty, Justice, and Ball. Thank you all for watching. So thank you again for being on this show. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the projects that you do.
Well, thanks a lot, Fadia. Honored to be here. Chris and I have this podcast. It's called Liberty, Justice, and Ball, as you mentioned. We started this, started talking about it in 2019. Chris was a student of mine at the time at Springfield College. You know, it's clear to me that he was someone who was lit with a certain deep intelligence and a passion for social justice issues and a love of basketball. And those are things that I share. And we talked, I think, first about this during a alternative spring break trip that we took down to St. Augustine, Florida in 2019, and decided that we would try to pull this together. And it's been incredibly satisfying, very, very interesting to me, and just so much fun to keep the connection going with Chris as he has gone on and graduated, and now just this week started a job with the New York Times. So he's, you know, he is a journalist on the rise, and it's really been an honor for me to work with him on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, Marty's always talking me up, but it's been my honor working with him too, and I've learned a lot from him. I began writing as a junior in high school, and then my passions were just sports. And after a while of writing and learning in a specific situation where a track teammate of mine was shot and killed before he was set to leave on a track scholarship, I learned about the power that social justice and sports together can have. And I met Marty, and we started this podcast that focuses on our love for basketball and just that social justice and into the audio space of journalism. So I think sports and social justice have been, and diversity, equity, and inclusions have become, some of my biggest passions. And, fuels me every day to, tell stories and seek the truth and report it like Marty tells us.
Good. I want to know a little bit about how you guys came to the name Liberty, Justice, and Ball, and why you've specifically focused on basketball.
Well, we just like the name. I mean, it just sounded, obviously it's a play on the, liberty and justice for all, that so many American kids, wind up saying with their hands over their hearts at the Pledge of Allegiance before classrooms. And it's, it just seemed like an interesting play on that. And basketball is just something that, I think we both loved from a very young age and recognized that in the game, there were some unique stories to be told about these issues. That basketball is a game that has a deep history among people who are Jewish, and that's me. People who are Black, that's Chris, and these days there are a number of professional athletes and basketball players who talk quite comfortably about issues of social justice. There's a certain cool factor about it. And so someone like LeBron James, that's a big part of what he's about. But for so many years, there was really an active attempt to discourage these conversations, to squelch them. And so our podcast, which has morphed, over to something that has now been taken over by the Basketball Hall of Fame. And so it's now Conversations with Basketball Hall of Famers. And those are all people of a certain age. And that age is generally, 50 and up. Maybe Grant Hill was a tiny bit below that, but generally we're 50 and up, which means to Chris, like really ancient people, right? And, but some of those, people, we've interviewed people as old as, Bob Cousy is in his 90s. And that generation of basketball players really did not tell their stories hardly at all. And so in that sense, I think our podcast has provided an opportunity for the first telling of some of these really fascinating and I think very important stories about a whole range of social justice issues. And I know Chris has been great about pushing us to look at that as expansively as possible about what social justice can be and should be.
So I wanted to ask both of you, what does diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and I guess in your case specifically, the term social justice mean to you? And why do you think it's important for us to put sports and DEIB together in conversation on a platform?
Yeah, I think in many senses, sports bridges a gap for many people. I like to think with my own journalism and my own work, I think I have a group of friends and family who will read certain things that I write. They'll read about, some of my friends will read about this basketball story, or some of my friends will read about the social justice story, but everyone reads about the story that has both. So I think sports and social justice can captivate the world. So and we've seen that with the WNBA and players like Colin Kaepernick, who have led the way on these really important charges of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, kneeling for the national anthem, or wearing shirts with bullet holes in them to represent police shootings. That really kickstarts the national conversation around police violence, gun violence, violence against black men or black women, or even conversations around that from political races, like we saw the runoff in Georgia that WNBA players led to get Raphael Warnock selected, and their owner, kind of sold the team or got out of the team after that. So I think sports has a unique power to kickstart kind of national conversations and even impact laws. And we've seen this all the way back to, the 60s, and people that we had on our podcast who have helped make that happen. So I think that's why sports and diversity and equity and inclusion are so important.
Marty, I'd love to know what you think about these concepts.
Yeah, I mean, Chris speaks to it so eloquently, but absolutely. I mean, I think sports has a unique role in our culture. There's such a sports obsession in our country, which is not always a good thing. I mean, I think there are ways in which, our attachment to sports takes our eyes off the focus of a lot of things that are really important. I mean, the results of games and who wins championships, these issues really are not, in the grand scheme, all that important. But, we love what we love, and this is compelling stuff. And obviously, a number of young children are very strongly influenced by athletes. And sports has an interesting way of pulling together a number of facets of our society and elements of our society that often would not come together otherwise, right? I mean, like sports teams often have a lot of diversity in them around race, around religion, around socioeconomic status. And it's not always a sense of people of privilege getting advantages. Same time, I would not subscribe to the belief that sports is this meritocracy. I think that's been blasted apart by a lot of good writing by a number. I mean, Howard Bryant, among others, have done a great job of really calling that into question. And certainly privilege can give you access to a lot of things in sports too, but probably more so than most parts of our society. Sports brings people together and creates an opportunity for some really rich conversations and some very healthy challenges around these issues, because people who might not necessarily be politically involved, when they hear even someone like Steve Kerr, the Warriors coach, they're in the NBA Finals right now, talking so passionately about our need to do something about gun violence, that has an impact. There's the real opportunity, I think, for athletes who have, and coaches who maybe have specialized skills that aren't all that important. You can throw a baseball 95 miles an hour. You can shoot a basketball from behind the three-point arc. That's not curing cancer, but those skills are some things that are really attractive to a lot of people. And consequently, athletes have a platform that, if they choose to use it, can really create some social good. And I think increasingly there are a number of athletes who are choosing to use it.
Sounds good. So one of the reasons why I'm doing this show is to show that systemic racism and systemic issues of inclusion and diversity, equity, and belonging really happen across industries, which is why each episode picks a different industry and focuses on it. And oftentimes the conclusion is the same, which is that the same type of challenges are really showing up in a lot of different industries to prevent people from moving forward. So what do you think, despite perhaps some similarities across industries, what are some of the unique challenges that you think sports has in general as a field for fostering diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Or do you think it has a unique advantage? I believe you guys suggested that it sort of brings people together, so it has a massive potential for social change. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of sports leagues dynamic, it's a lot like how Marty said, at the playing level, the people on the field or on the court or on the track or whatever your means of playing is, those people are oftentimes very much from different backgrounds and different areas, different races, very diverse. But people who are coaching those players or who own those franchises or who are in those front offices, which are general managers or even high level scouts, those people often are not. They're more so white men, and that's one of the biggest challenges that sports leagues like the NFL and the NBA face, where the NBA now has 15 Black head coaches in a league that's 70% Black. So that's half of the head coaches. But in the NFL, there's just 4 Black head coaches for a league that's 70% Black, which seems, a little, kind of crazy when you consider the amount of Black players that have come through the league. And when the players are told that, they're not good enough or they're just not smart enough, that can't possibly be the case. So I think the challenge of sports in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion is trying to get marginalized people in those positions, decision-making positions. So coaches, high-level scouts, general managers, or also another odd thing about sports or specific sports is there's a pipeline to those positions. So if you're a Black head coach and you're a defensive coordinator, the pipeline often doesn't lead you to that head coaching position. So if your offensive coordinators are largely white, those are people who usually get hired to those positions, or even in the scouting realm, like director of college scouting or vice president of player personnel, things of that sort. So I think the challenges in sports in terms of equity inclusion is getting marginalized people of color in those decision-making positions.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. And I think that we've also approached it in the podcast looking at gender too as an issue, where there are, for instance, in the WNBA, a number of men's coaches, and in women's college basketball, that there are a lot of the top coaching positions have gone to men. Now that women's basketball has reached a level of prominence and there's more money in coaching, a lot of those jobs have become men's jobs. And so Chris and I have been really interested in this. We've talked to a number of women coaches. We've been trying very hard to get Dawn Staley on the podcast, who is, a great leader around this. She's the head coach, University of South Carolina, that's won a couple national championships. And that is a really interesting issue. And even we've started to see inroads that have been made with women even coaching, in traditionally male fields. There's a manager in the New York Yankees farm system in baseball now who's a woman, and a number of, rising coaches who are women, really in all sports. And that's still a very, very small percentage, but we're beginning to see, some breakthroughs there. And obviously, I think a lot more work is yet to be done. But absolutely, I think we need to really look at those positions of power, not just the athletes themselves, but, the coaches, the general managers, and that curious word for the CEOs of these teams, that they are quote unquote owners, which is such a weird vestige of like a sort of slavery type mentality. Granted, top level professional athletes in a sport like the NFL or the NBA are hugely compensated, but they are also property in a certain sense. And the fact that they can be traded, it's a part of sports, but it's an odd thing. Like, Fadi, if you or I, if down the road, if, Western New England University decided, oh, we want to trade one of our journalism professors for Marty Dobrow, and all of a sudden, got to move my office across town in Springfield. Obviously it's crazy, but in sports, there still is that kind of property sort of mentality.
Yeah, and actually, for a person who doesn't know a lot about the systemic, sort of the structures of running the sports industry in the United States, I find that whole trading thing really, really weird. From an outsider perspective, looking in, because I'm interested in cricket, which is a sport that's played primarily outside of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And only recently have they adopted the trading model for the leagues. Before, you couldn't trade players. So it's a very American system, it seems, or is it in other countries as well?
Yeah. There are some weird things about the economy of sports like that, where they try to sort of jerry-rig things for like quote unquote competitive balance. So they have like a draft, and it's like, the concept of it in one way is so odd. So let's say that, Chris, when he was graduating in 2021, was the #1 draft choice among journalism students in America, which is just about right in my mind that he would have been. And so it's great that he's wound up at the New York Times. That's appropriate. But should the worst newspaper in the country have then had the opportunity to draft Chris Rim to hire him? Absolutely not. So there are certain things about sports that are sort of unique, I guess, within the economy. It's important for there to be quote unquote competitive balance.
Yeah.
But there's some very sort of odd dimensions of it.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Chris, did you want to say something?
No, I was going to say American sports are different from like Europe with soccer, for example, they keep competitive balance by the teams who aren't competitive. They just drop to a lower league, versus like you get in soccer versus like you get the top pick. But trading is kind of similar there, and you can buy players. So there's kind of that property aspect to it.
Okay. Well, something interesting that I'll have to research after this, because I'm totally curious now in the context of cricket, that how extensive it is in the world of international cricket, because I feel that the league system has brought that on. But before when the national teams from around the world were playing each other, I believe there weren't any trading going on. But again, I'm going to research. Cool stuff to read at night tonight. So, I wanted to now ask you guys a really interesting question that I always get really colorful answers from people, which is, so what would you say has been intentional in your life when it comes to DEIB work? Would you say that you sort of understood the importance of doing work related to DEIB and social justice along the way, or was it something that you guys intentionally set out to doing as a commitment to your career and to your life?
Yeah, like I said, for me, I think in terms of the spark in my life, I briefly mentioned it earlier, but long story short, I grew up in Philadelphia and I ran track, and the person I ran track against, he was shot and killed a day before he was set to leave for Penn State University on a full track scholarship. He was a really talented athlete. And it was an issue that many young Black men like me fear, kind of losing our lives in that way, and an issue that is problematic in Philadelphia. And like I said earlier, I think from that situation, I really became passionate about issues of social justice and DIB and equity, and learn more about the many aspects of social justice and how broad it is, and how it reaches across gender, race, sexuality, and learning about these many different aspects. So I think after that, it definitely became intentional, and I followed those passions throughout college, working with Marty, applying to work with the board of trustees and work with those issues on the highest governing body of the college. So I'll say that's when it became intentional for me, when I was around a junior in high school. And I think also obviously the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor obviously amplified that as well, and made me passionate about learning about these things.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Chris. Marty?
Yeah, I'd say, Chris came to it a lot more quickly than I did. I wish I had come to it earlier. For me, I think it's a few things. One, I'm not a deeply observant Jewish person by any means, but I did grow up. Remember going to like religious school, Sunday school, and part of that routinely back in the days before like safe spaces and trigger warnings. We would see these grainy black and white films from the concentration camps, and these images of these gaunt, bony, barely alive Jewish people pushing these carcasses of other people into these mass graves that they themselves would probably wind up in. And that, was just, this sort of like never forget mentality that's sort of deeply ingrained, I think, in a lot of Jewish people. Like that made an impression on me on some level. And then the other thing, from a very young age, and I've told this story a number of times, but my first sort of memory of the larger world was the day of Martin Luther King's assassination. I was 7 at the time, and I remember it vividly just because of the special report that came across the television. My mom, who was behind me, it was up in her bedroom, the small black and white television. This report comes on, and I just heard her in this very stricken voice say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And I'd never seen her so emotional before, and it scared me, honestly. But it also imprinted on me that Martin Luther King, what a powerful man. And so ever since, there's sort of been this sort of fascination with King. And then just by weird coincidence, I wind up at Springfield College, many years later, and find out that King was the commencement speaker here. And that, when I looked into that story, it became really transformative for me and became the impetus for a lot of the research that I'm doing, articles that I've written, book that I'm working on, a lot of the social justice work, I think, flowed from that and got grounded by beginning to really bring it into the classroom. And then I think was really just brought to the surface deeply. And honestly, with this partnership with Chris, because the conversations that we've had have been so interesting, not just the ones on the podcast, but it's been a great partnership because I've learned, easily as much from Chris as he's learned from me. And he challenges me in some really good ways. And I think that we've really been able to forge a deeper commitment to these issues together. And that's, I think that's been just a cool part of the process for me.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. And thank you for those very personal stories, because oftentimes when we look back into our histories, there are turning points in our lives that seem to impact everything that we do for the rest of our lives. And that has happened to me in my own situations as well. And I can fully relate. In fact, my interest in work related to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and really came into being from personal bad experiences. So I had workplace experiences that were negative, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that really clarified to me the challenges that people of color face in the workplace and how little there is in place for them to feel protected when it comes to how you want to respond when injustices happen to you. And that really got me interested in this field. So I guess it's coming from a selfish place of a negative experience, but I don't think it has to be that, because I really want to transform that into something that can help people in all workplaces, which is one of the reasons why I started this show. So yeah, it's always interesting to hear from people what drives them to doing what they do. So I really want to know, and I'm sure the guests and the audience that are watching this show really want to know, that what is the advice that you'd want to give newbies who want to break into the podcast industry or the media industry from any historically marginalized group that really want to make content that is relevant, that is sharp, that's edgy, and that's, making a change and making a difference? And also, how did you build your partnership with the Basketball Hall of Fame? Because those are the things that really get projects visibility. So any advice for people wanting to break through?
Yeah, I think I would just say find a nice Jewish guy. No, I'm just playing. I think it's tough, because I think I'd want to say, you have to work really hard and you have to make sure you're working hard and it'll come. But I think it's having a good idea, finding your niche, finding your lane, finding what's different about what you bring, because the podcast space is very, oversaturated right now. Everyone has a podcast. So it's easy to start up, it's easy to do. So just finding what makes you unique and finding why should people come and listen to you. I think that's what me and Marty started with, and doing that. And then 2, just being consistent, even if people aren't coming, if you're not having a lot of listenership, just be consistent and push it on social media and make sure your friends are listening, because you have to start somewhere. Rome was built in a day, that cliche. But most importantly, I think for us is just like kind of luck, but also like, I guess, networking, I guess I would say, making sure you network with other podcasters, I think I'm of the belief that everyone can help you. So trying to talk to people because someone might know someone that can help you, right? Marty and I don't know if we necessarily worked harder than anyone else or anything like that, but it just so happens that the Basketball Hall of Fame, basketball was started at Springfield College. We have a great relationship with the Hall of Fame, and the president of the Hall of Fame was looking for something in the realm of social justice, and we were there at the perfect time to do so. So I think it's a lot of the things I mentioned, networking and all of that, but I think luck plays a big role, and I don't want to make it seem like we just worked harder or had some kind of magic that no one else has. I think there's some luck that plays a role into it.
I absolutely agree. I think we just pursued this because we liked the topic, and we thought that it would be fun to do a creative project together. And I don't think that we were necessarily looking at this that would be something that would really become very big. And we definitely want it to grow a lot. I mean, I think it's still in its early stages, and we're having some growing pains about finding the right path with the Basketball Hall of Fame. We're thrilled to have their sponsorship. I think it's, potentially it's great. And, I think they're trying to figure out the best way of working with us and finding the pathway to make this grow as much as it possibly can. One thing I would say is that you don't need to be a technological whiz about this. Like, podcasting is really pretty easy. And granted, I mean, Chris has a lot more of these technological skills than I do. Like, when we were doing it ourselves, he was really producing it and editing it. But the technology is not hugely complicated. There are a lot of college students who put together podcasts. I think having a good name helps. I think having a niche really helps. Having, as Chris says, something that really sort of separates you. Like, one of the things that I think that our guests often respond to is our relationship. They like the fact, that, wow, this is pretty cool. Like, this young Black guy, this much older white guy, different generations, different races, different religions, all that sort of stuff. But obvious chemistry between the two of us, I think that's appealing to others, and it gives us something that is advantageous. So it's good to be able to sort of put that chemistry into a podcast, to make it not be really formulaic. I mean, Chris was great at the first part of the podcast. Like, I was trying to script everything and write these questions, and he would just kind of be shaking his head and just, saying that, telling me, you have to trust it. Like, we can talk about planning it a little bit, but you just have to really let it flow. He's absolutely right. Like, you need that human element, that spontaneity, that chemistry. I think that's really appealing to an audience.
Absolutely. And since I'm also designing episodes, I fully understand the whole part about how people need to be able to flow and gel together. And some of it is just spontaneous based on what the person is telling you as an answer. And that may trigger some questions that you haven't planned for. And by the way, Marty, you already touched upon my next thing I was going to ask you, which is about what do you think it brings to to your podcast that you have a young Black male and an older white male working together in an allied position on a project on sports and social justice? Because as far as I can see, this relationship can only open doors, because there's a lot of gatekeeping that Chris may face because of his age or because of him being a young Black male wanting to talk about sports and inclusion. And I feel that your identity helps with the whole process of opening certain doors, and Chris's identity helps with opening certain doors. So I think it's like a win-win as far as I can see.
No doubt about it. I mean, I think that we've been able to sort of use the various advantages that each of us bring. And, I mean, let's face it. I mean, Chris brings a sort of, a modern sensibility to this, and is able to connect with people in some ways that really difficult for me to do. And I like to believe that I bring some historical perspective that's also valuable. I think we have a deep mutual respect for each other, a recognition that both of our ideas are really important to listen to, that it's not one of us who's running the show. There are certainly times where I will step back and really, like, Chris will be front and center. There are times that he'll step back. So I think that that's important. And it's a lot of the work that we have to do, obviously, as a country. I mean, we have just been not done from the beginning of the country, from actually way before the beginning of the country. We have just had done such a poor job about becoming a multiracial democracy in a real way. and a place of real equality and real equity. And there's so many growing pains about that still for all of our, our great leaders, for all the, Abraham Lincoln and MLK and Barack Obama and, Stacey Abrams, for all these, incredible people. We are still riven with so much anguish about how poorly our country has navigated race, how far we've fallen short of so many of our expressed ideals about, we the people and everybody being, equal and liberty and justice for all. I mean, we're a long way from that. And that's the work, right? That's always been the work. I think that's the great quest. And it's interesting. I see in the background, it's so, because this is my neighbor's American flag, I believe, not mine. It's interesting. I see it waving in the background.
I thought you did that on purpose or something.
No, I just noticed it, but it's,
I love it.
I
I
mean,
mean, mention it. I loved having that in the back. And it's
yeah, I mean,
what you're
the
saying.
ideals are beautiful. The stated goals in our founding documents, I mean, are fantastic things to strive for. But I think we just always have to be honest and real about how are we falling short, what are the gaps, and what's our responsibility to live up to what that flag is supposed to stand for. And, I think the hope is that our podcast is a little tiny piece of that puzzle.
Well, I can tell you that it really makes me feel very uncomfortable that a certain group of people in this country who are feeling that all lives matter rather than Black lives matter are wanting to own the flag. And I don't think the American flag belongs to one group of Americans. And I think that's a mistake. So it's very disheartening for me to see as I'm driving through, say, a series of people who have something saying all lives matter or some other regressive message like that will have the American flag. And then you see houses which just say Black Lives Matter with no American flags on it. I really think that the American flag should not be belonging to one group of Americans versus the other. And so that's why I was actually very interested in having the flag in the back, because I knew that this was going to be a break from the association of the flag with only a certain group of people in this country. So to wrap up, I wanted to know a little bit more about sort of what are your thoughts about continuing this project and what's coming up? What are you guys up to when it comes to the episodes going forward and generally the work that you're doing together and separately?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the podcast goes, I hope we could continue it for as long as possible. I've always wanted to be a multimedia journalist. So having podcasting and writing, both being strong suits and even video is important to me. And also social justice and sports is really important to me. And so I think we want to continue doing this podcast and continue to get guests and get guests that people guests that have interesting stories to tell, and guests that get our listeners really excited, and who just make us laugh and also make us a little bit frustrated. I think that's what some of this work does when you're kind of not reliving these moments, but hearing about these situations that whether it be racism or sexism or some form of discrimination, it's also painful in a way, but I think it helps you. Learning from people's lived experiences helps me navigate my own. It's somewhat of a healing for me too, talking to some of these people. And also, it's cool to just learn about the game. I love basketball too, so it's cool to learn about the game too. And people are talking, or Marty says something, or Bob Cousy says something that maybe I had no clue about, or there's a baseball reference, and I'm learning about baseball too because Marty knows that's not my strong suit. But yeah, so I think as far as the podcast goes, I want to continue to do it, and I think it's really important and impactful. And in my own work, just hope to continue to do well, and hopefully do well at the the times with this fellowship and just continue to keep being better than yesterday and just become the best journalist I could be.
Sounds good. And I'm sure you'll do it. Marty, tell us about what your thoughts are about this podcast and going forward with your book. And I read the article that you wrote about MLK visiting campus, and that was a fantastic piece. So please do send it to me so that I can put it in the website for Talking Out a Line for others to read and access.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this sort of work is hugely important to me too. And I mean, I think the podcast is a big piece of it for sure. And I share the hope that we're going to be able to continue this for a long time. I think there's a lot of great work to be done, a lot of really interesting people to talk with. We have, in some recent episodes, we've really fanned out in a number of different dimensions of social justice and even mental health issues. We had a really raw and intense conversation with Jerry West, who's one of the all-time great basketball players, that was really touching on some very profound, hard mental health issues. And, Chris was saying about how like some of these conversations are difficult. There's tension in it. And that's, I think for both of us, that's kind of the appeal. We're not wanting to be those kind of like sports journalists who are, tell me about how great you are and how you threw this perfect pitch, or tell us about that game-winning shot. Like that stuff is not where we're at with this podcast. We're really deliberately going after hard terrain and difficult stories and the stuff that's painful, because I think that's where the growth is. And I certainly, I try to take that lesson into my own writing too. And I think for me, it's really morphed over the years. Like, I think I got started with journalism, very much as a sports writer, and I loved sports and the drama of sports, the unscripted drama of games, still do. But increasingly that sort of began to sort of shift over to a blend of sort of sports and social justice, because I think there was a whole lightly explored terrain there, great stories that most journalists weren't going after. And I found that to be a very rich vein. And then ultimately more for me into a lot of like civil rights stuff and this ongoing story that I have been mining now over a number of years that, I'm working on a book for, and I've had a number of spin-offs with, stories in the Washington Post. I had one this past February that was an offshoot. I have another one coming later this month. That sort of stuff is really rich for me. I just think it's important stuff. This whole world, like social justice becomes a bit of a cliche, perhaps, but it's big and important work. Journalism is a great way to get to that stuff. And it just gives me such a sense of hope when I see someone like Chris at his, young age deciding like this is the path and going after it with such passion and intensity and commitment amid all of the really hard things in the world right now. And there are plenty of them. That's the kind of thing that still gives me a real sense of hope for the future.
Yep. And I can commend Chris on that as well, because I came to my commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work in my early 30s. I'm 38 now, so around the age of 30. And before that, I was doing it without the name social justice. I was calling it social change. But I really feel like I understood the importance and commitment to this work in my way around the 30s. And you're starting younger, way younger. So that's awesome. It's and good luck to you. So thank you so much, both of you, for talking about yourself, your commitment to social justice, and your show, Liberty, Justice, and Ball. So please stay in touch and send along all of your episodes to me whenever it's coming out, because I would love to feature them in the Talking Out a Line website and the social media, so we can do some cross collaborating on that. So thank you again. And it was really a pleasure talking to you all, and hope to see you again next time. See ya.